But I'll start the class. Let me share the screen. Sean, you might need to enable screen sharing.
Oh, yeah, I will make you host. Yeah, no, you should be okay.
All right, so here it is. Are you all able to see the board?
Yes.
Great. Today we'll talk about restricting our opponent's pieces. We are using the same study as before. So if you want to join the study, I will send you the link now. Let me just open the chat. Here it is. Just click on the link and you'll get transferred to this study. If I haven't sent an invitation to any one of you, just let me know and I'll include you in the study. Okay. Now we'll take a look at a game played between Capablanca as white. You have all heard about Jose Raul Capablanca. He was a Cuban player, a world champion from the 20th century. And this game is again Milan Vidmar. Let's take a look at the position we have on the board. What do you think about this position? Who is better here and why? Any ideas? All right. Eric says that black is better. Black does have slightly more space on the queen side because of this pawn on b4. Black is occupying 5 ranks in total. But that's not really that big of a difference in space. And about the center control, it is relatively even. Black has e5 in the center and white has e4. Black doesn't have a better control of the center. Both have one pawn on a central square. White here is actually better, and that is because of the bishop pair. This position is quite open, so the bishop pair is stronger than the bishop and the knight for black. Also, we have the rooks on the board. Bishops are better with the rooks than the knights. If you have a rook on the board, it's very likely that you would rather have a bishop instead of the knight. The knights work better with our queens than with our rooks. White's only problem in this position is that he hasn't finished his development yet. But that is something that White can change. White can develop his dark squared bishop. Black cannot change the fact that he doesn't have the bishop pair. White's weakness, lack of development, is only temporary, while Black will stay with the bishop and the knight against the bishop pair for the rest of the game. Let's find the best continuation for White. What do you suggest? Okay, so Black is attacking White's pawn on e4. So White does need to do something about this pawn. How can he protect e4? Defending with a bishop like this is not a good idea. It is quite passive. The bishop had an excellent diagonal, and now it has a very defensive role. Black can also continue with a normal developing move such as rook c8, and that bishop will be under attack. The best move here for White is f3. Now, if you take a look at Black's bishop, you will notice that this bishop is restricted. It's not doing that much on this diagonal any longer because of White's last move. This is one of the very common strategies how we can restrict the opponent's bishop by using this pawn structure f3 and e4. This example can be seen in many games. Now Black's bishop is not doing that much. Black decided to develop the rook. A logical move for Black, placing the rook on an open file. How should White continue? Bishop g5 is a good move, but it is stronger to go to e3. You do have this pin, but you wouldn't want to take black's knight and give up your bishop pair. So that pin cannot be really that useful for you. Bishop e3 is a better move. After bishop e3, you are controlling the center, your piece is centralized, and also you have a possibility to play bishop b6, attacking the rook on d8 and also the pawn. That can be useful later on. We might be able to use this double attack to win the pawn. All of white's pieces are controlling the center. The only one left is this rook. We need to include the rook. It will occupy one of the central files, and all of white's pieces will be well coordinated in the center. When you play a move bishop d5, your bishop is not working together with the rest of white's pieces, and that can be a problem. None of white's pieces are actually doing much on the king side. Instead, these pieces are controlling the center. Now black cannot play a very natural rook c8. He always needs to think about something like bishop b6. So he decided to play h6. Not really that useful for him. He does get an escape square for the king, but that's not necessary at the moment. White has these two open files, and he wants to occupy both of them. That's why rook e d1. He is leaving the other file for his a rook. Now black played bishop c6, and after rook c1, he retreated the bishop. Let's find the best continuation for white now. What do you suggest? White needs to continue improving his position. How can he do that? Rook c7 is an excellent move. It was not played in the game, but it is a good alternative. After this, black will most likely continue by taking the rook in order to make white's bishop passive. But this will not help his position actually. The bishop will go back, And we have an excellent rook on the 7th rank. Both the rook and the bishop are putting pressure on f7. Also, white has a possibility to attack the pawn on a5 as well. Black is already in a very difficult situation. In the game, white chose to improve the position of his king. You know that in the endgame, when the queens are off the board and when the king cannot be threatened, he becomes an active piece. Now black traded and played rook c8, occupying this open file. There is something very important that we should know about open files. Oh, the rook will not go to c1. White will of course take. I'm just showing you the open file that black is controlling. If you take a look at this open file, there are some entry points on the opponent's part of the board. And the open file is only useful if we can use these entry points. The C file has these 4 squares, but black cannot use any of them. That's why the C file is not good for black. It is open, but it doesn't matter. Black cannot use it. If we take a look at white's file, we have these entry points. Entry points are just the squares on the opponent's part of the board. If you take a look at white's file, white does have some options. It's much easier for white to occupy any of these squares than it is for black. What next for white? How to further improve? There are a couple of good options. Improving the king like this does make sense. But white chose something else. Do you have any ideas? King g3. Okay, where will the king go next? After king g3, the only square you can go forward to is h4. And after that, you don't have any options. So the king on g3 is not that active. In the endgame, the king usually belongs in the center. If you compare e2 and g3 for the king, you'll notice that e2 offers more possibilities to white's king. The, the king, okay, so king g3 with the idea of f4. Let me just play a random move for black. If you push f4, you will lose e4. But let's say you protect that pawn. I'll just make this a random move to protect the pawn. Even in that case, f4 wouldn't be good. King takes. Take a look at white's pawn structure right here. What changed? Does white have any weaknesses after this trade? If we check that line one more time, after the trade, white got an isolated pawn, and that's not good for him. Now let's say rook c2 and black is just fine. Pushing f4 would simply lead to white having an isolated pawn. White instead played g4, getting more space on the king side. Bishop d7. What next? How can white try to win some material? Any ideas for white? Remember that we mentioned that these pawns can be quite weak, especially a5. We can attack this pawn with bishop b6. Now, if black tries to protect, how can white improve his position. Is there a way to win any material here? H4 does improve white's position, but it doesn't win any material. Of course, your threat is to push g5, after which when the knight moves, the bishop will be hanging. But black has a way to protect against this. There is something else. White can play a move after which black will not be able to defend, and he will lose some material. Bishop d5 doesn't win material. For example, rook a6. Of course, in the line you showed, white will win at least a pawn. But it gives black a possibility to get some material himself and to complicate the position. If rook a6, bishop takes. There is something else for black. What can black now capture? What is unprotected in white's position? The bishop on b6 is unprotected, but it is not attacked. There is another white piece, which is unprotected and is under attack. Black can take it. The pawn, excellent. So, if here you go for bishop d5, you are allowing some complications after this. Take a look at our bishops now. We have the opposite colored bishops. What do you know about the opposite colored bishops in the endgame? All right, so let's talk about the opposite colored bishops in more detail. In the endgame, if we have the opposite colored bishops, we have to know that it is usually a draw. There are some positions in which, even if we are 2 or 3 pawns up, but we have the opposite colored bishops, the game is a draw. So here, because of the opposite colored bishops, the game might end in a draw, and that's not something white wants. White had a winning advantage. If we go back, a white here has another move, and that is bishop c7, attacking both a5 and e5. Black cannot protect both of these pawns. After this move, he'll have to give up one of them. So if we go back, for that reason, Black didn't want to protect a5 because he would lose one pawn either way. He decided to go for bishop e6 after white's bishop b6. What should white do now? Take and create more weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Taking the pawn here is an excellent move, winning a pawn threatening to take on b4. But it allows some complications after rook c2. White, of course, still has the winning advantage, but we don't want to allow our opponent to get any counter chances. Can you find another way to win this game and not allow black counterplay? H4 does allow counterplay to black. You will lose this pawn. So that's not it. What instead? Rook d2 protects against black's threat, but it's a rather passive move. Let's find something that's more active. King e3 is possible, and white does still have advantage, but again, rook c2. If rook d2, rook c1. Now this rook can come behind white's pawns. Again, white is better, but this is not something that we want to allow our opponent unless we have to. The best move is a rook d8. Let's see why. Now black is forced to trade, and we transposed into a minor piece endgame. Rook endgames are more complicated than minor piece endgames. If we are in a rook endgame, There is a possibility for us to make a mistake. We have to worry about more things. Black's rook can become very active if we are not careful. That's why it's a good idea to trade rooks and get a minor piece endgame. Black will not be able to create any complications now, and it will be much harder for him to save the game. When playing, always think about which pieces you want to trade and which you want to leave on the board. Now, Black cannot protect a5, so he decided to activate the knight. And now knight c4, attacking the pawn. How should white continue to win the game? Any ideas for white? Taking the pawn is the first thing that we should consider, but this is not a good move. Who can tell me why? Knight d3, and black will win the bishop. So we cannot take on b4. What should white play instead? Excellent, b3. Now, black doesn't have anything better than to take on b3. What is the continuation? Excellent. Knight d4 and now a5. At this moment, black resigned the game. If he tries to stop this pawn, all right, what about this position? Was it an accident or you have some questions? All right, let's go back to our game then. If black tries to stop this pawn with something like this, notice that white can even push, because if black takes, white will promote. So black resigned after a5. If we go back to our starting position, white managed to win this game by restricting the opponent's bishop, by finishing the development and occupying the open files that we have on the board. He was able to use the entry points on the opponent's part of the board. Are there any questions about this game? All right, let's take a look at another example. We'll check this game that Effin Geller played as white. Again, our topic is restricting our opponent's pieces. If you take a look at this game, you'll notice that white's pieces are more active. His rook on d7 is well placed. His rook on f1 is occupying a half open file. The knight and the bishop are also well placed. Black's pieces are rather passive. This rook is protecting the bishop. This rook is protecting the pawn. The knight is not doing that much on g7. Also, the bishop could be improved as well. How would you continue here as white? Any ideas? Mm, all right. In this position, white has a way to restrict the activity of black's knight. How can he do that? How can white make sure that this knight has no squares to go to? That the knight needs to stay passive on g7. The move here for white is g4. Since this is an endgame, we don't have to worry about our king's safety, and we can push this pawn forward. Now, if you take a look at black's knight, you'll notice that he is completely restricted. This knight has no squares to go to. It is not doing anything right now. So g4 is a very important move because it makes one of black's pieces passive. Now black tried to remove this pawn by pushing h5, and white simply protected it. It would be a mistake to take on h5 and allow the knight to get some squares available. b5. Black is sacrificing a pawn on b5, but he doesn't have anything better actually. Do you have any other suggestions for black? The rooks cannot move because both of them are protecting something. The knight cannot move. There are no squares for the knight, and the bishop cannot move because f7 will be hanging. Black doesn't have any good options here, so he played b5. Now the best for white, of course, was to continue by capturing this knight and this pawn with the knight. And if black takes on c2, can you find the winning move now for white? After this move, white will get a very good position, and with accurate play, white will win the game. Knight d6, excellent, Nicholas. After this move, black is forced to take the knight. If he moves the rook, he will lose the bishop. So he has to take, and now we recapture with the pawn. We have a passed pawn on d6. Also, we are attacking black's f7 one. If black tries to protect, how would you continue as white? Excellent, rook e7, allowing the pawn to go forward. If, for example, rook takes, we have e7. If rook b8, We can play something like bishop d4. And it's only a matter of time when black will resign. Okay, so back to the game. White didn't take on b5. Instead, he played knight e4. Knight e4 is also a good move. Let's see what the idea is. If black now takes on c2, can you find the winning move? White can win material here. Let's find how. Knight d6 still works, with the same idea as before, but there is a better move. Knight f6, excellent. We have a fork. If black moves his king, we will win the rook. And if black takes, we take back and this knight is trapped. Now, black tried taking the pawn on b2, and white, of course, captured on g7. What happens if black takes on g7? What is the continuation for white? Great. So black cannot take. Instead, he played f5. Let's continue. Bishop d4 does make sense, and it is a good move, but it is not the strongest one. There is a faster way for white to win the game. There is another plan. Do you have any ideas? The move is rook f3. what is the plan behind this move? What do you think? Excellent. White wants to give a checkmate. Black tried to protect against it with pawn takes. How should a white continue here? Great. In the game, white just chose a different square. Instead of rook g3, white went over here. But it is completely the same plan. And now black made a mistake. How should white continue after this move? Okay, taking the pawn is fine. There is no checkmate on c1. Black would probably continue with something like this. But white still has a winning position. There is something, even bishop d4, yes. There is something stronger than taking on g4. Let's try to find this move. It is a tactical idea. White would like to play rook f8, but white cannot do that because of black's rook that's protecting the 8th rank. So the move is bishop c5. Let's see what happens. If black takes, white wins with a rook f8 and a rook h8 checkmate. He doesn't even have to promote. And if black doesn't take and he plays something else, something random, again white wins with rook f8. If black moves, we promote. And if black takes, again we can promote with a checkmate. For that reason, after bishop c5, black resigned the game. Let's go back to our starting position. White managed to win this game by completely restricting black's pieces. This move g4 was quite important to restrict the knight, and it is an idea that we should remember. Pushing a flank pawn to restrict the knight is quite common. Sometimes it can happen on the other part of the board as well. It doesn't have to be on the king's side. After this, Black didn't have any good moves. His pieces were quite restricted. Are there any questions about this game? All right, I assume there are no questions. So today's class was all about restricting the opponent's pieces. In the first game, we were able to restrict opponent's bishop, and in the second game, we were able to restrict our opponent's knight, again using our pawn. We'll continue with game analysis next week, same time. We'll have another topic. I hope you enjoyed the lesson and you learned something new about restricting the opponent's pieces. I'll stop sharing the screen now and I'll see you guys next week, same time. Have a good week. Bye.